The station world of Ethira Prime was older than most civilizations that walked its halls, a rotating megastructure of crystal and living metal that hung in the void between three dying stars. And on this day it was full of laughter. Ambassador Elena Vargas stood at the center of the Grand Council chamber and kept her back straight while 12 elder species looked down at her from their elevated platforms like gods examining an insect that had somehow crawled onto their table. She wore the dark blue uniform of the United Earth Diplomatic Corps, and her black hair was pulled back tight, and her face showed nothing at all. The chamber was enormous and shaped like an inverted dome, so that every sound bounced and echoed and multiplied a whisper, became a rumble, and laughter became thunder. And there was so much laughter. Elena had traveled 14 months to reach this place. She had crossed 6 relay gates and endured the suffocating atmosphere of 3 alien stations and smiled through 17 diplomatic dinners, where the food was not meant for human stomachs. She had done all of this to stand here and say 5 sentences. The United Nations of Earth formally petitions the Galactic Council for a territorial sovereignty charter. We request recognition of a 200-system sphere around our home star. We ask for nothing that belongs to another species. We ask only for the right to call our small corner of space our own. We ask to be recognized as equals. The silence that followed lasted exactly 4 seconds, and then the Draelith delegation began to hiss. The Draelith were reptilian creatures that stood nearly 3 meters tall with scaled hides, the color of burnt iron, and teeth designed for tearing flesh. They had ruled the galaxy's military structure for 9,000 years, and their supreme commander sat on the highest platform of all. Elder Speaker Rothan Vel was ancient even by Draelith standards, and his scales had faded to a dull gray, and his eyes were the color of old blood. He leaned forward, and his voice filled the chamber without any need for amplification. "Let me understand this correctly," he said, and his tone was the kind of patient amusement that a parent might use with a very stupid child. "The humans wish to be recognized as equals." He paused and looked around the chamber, and every delegate from every species was watching him because, when Rothan Vel spoke, the galaxy listened. "These are the creatures who achieved faster-than-light travel only 40 years ago, using a method so crude that we abandoned it before most of your species learned to use fire. They burn chemical fuel, they wield kinetic slugs, they have no psionic capability, and no energy shielding, and their ships are held together with metal bolts, and what I am told is called welding." A ripple of amusement spread through the chamber. The Veleni delegation, which consisted of tall and impossibly thin beings made of what appeared to be living light, flickered in their version of a smile. The Kreth Dominion representatives clicked their mandibles together in rapid succession, which was how insectoid species laughed. Rothan Vel spread his clawed hands wide and delivered the line that would be remembered long after his empire turned to dust. "Shall we also grant sovereignty to bacteria?" The chamber exploded. Every species laughed in their own way. The Draelith hissed and stamped. The Veleni pulsed with bright cascading colors. The Kreth clicked so fast it sounded like rain on metal. The Urani, who were massive whale-like beings suspended in gravity tanks, let out deep resonant booms that shook the floor. Even the smaller species, the ones who had no real power, and simply followed whoever was strongest, joined in, because that was how survival worked in galactic politics. Elena stood in the center of it all and did not move. She had known this would happen. She had known it before she left Earth, and she had known it during the 14 months of travel, and she had known it when she walked into this chamber and looked up at 12 species that controlled more firepower than her mind could calculate. She had known, and she had come anyway, because the knowing was the point. She waited for the laughter to fade, and it took a long time, but eventually even the Draelith grew tired of their own amusement. Rothan Vel wiped a clawed hand across his snout and looked down at her with something that might have been pity if he were capable of such a thing. "Your petition is denied," he said, No vote is required. The Council does not recognize the sovereignty of pre-industrial civilizations. And by our standards, that is what you are. You may continue to inhabit your little worlds. We will not stop you, but you are not equals, you are not members, you are tolerated guests, and you should be grateful for that much. Elena nodded once. I understand, she said. I would like the Council's decision to be formally recorded. Rothenvel waved a hand dismissively. It is recorded. It has always been recorded. Every species that comes before us with the same delusion receives the same answer. You are not the first, and you will not be the last. I understand, Elena said again, and there was something in her voice that made the Velani ambassador tilt their luminous head, but no one else noticed because no one else was paying attention to the human anymore. She was already forgotten. Elena turned and walked out of the chamber, and her boots made sharp sounds on the crystal floor, and not one delegate watched her go. They had already moved on to the next item on the agenda, which was a trade dispute between the Kreth and the Urani over mineral rights in the Velen expanse. She walked through the corridors of Ethira Prime and past the embassies of species that had been part of galactic civilization for millennia, and past the observation windows that showed the endless dark of space, and past the guards who did not bother to acknowledge her, because she was human and humans were barely worth noticing. She reached the small and cramped quarters that had been assigned to the Earth delegation, which were located in a section of the station, usually reserved for maintenance workers, and waste processing. Her aide Marcus Chen was waiting inside, and his face was tight with anger. I watched the whole thing, he said. Every second of it. They broadcast it on the public channels for entertainment. Elena, they made it entertainment. I know, she said. How are you so calm? Elena sat down at the narrow communications desk and entered a sequence of codes that activated the quantum link transmitter, which was the one piece of human technology that the elder races had not figured out yet, because humanity had been very careful to keep it secret. The transmitter connected to Sol Command on Luna in a way that could not be intercepted or decoded. She typed 5 words. They said no. Begin Prometheus. Marcus watched her, and his anger slowly changed into something else, something that looked almost like fear. Elena, he said quietly, what is Prometheus? She looked at him, and for the first time since arriving at Ethira Prime, she allowed herself to smile, and it was not a warm smile, and it was not a kind smile, and it was the smile of someone who had been planning for this exact moment for a very long time. Prometheus, she said, is what happens when you laugh at the wrong species. Far away across the cold distance of space, the message arrived at Luna Command and was decoded by exactly 3 people in a room that did not officially exist. Admiral James Okafor read the 5 words and closed his eyes and let out a long breath. He had hoped it would not come to this. He had spent 20 years building something terrible, and he had prayed every single night that he would never have to use it. He opened his eyes and picked up the phone and said 2 words. Wake them. Across the solar system, in shipyards hidden inside hollowed-out asteroids, and beneath the frozen surface of Europa, and in orbital platforms disguised as mining stations, lights began to turn on. Engines that had never been fired began to hum. Weapons that had never been tested outside of simulation began their power-up sequences. And in the vast darkness between stars, something was waking up. Something that the Laughing Council had never imagined. Something human. Fleet Admiral James Okafor had not slept in 3 days, and he did not plan to sleep for 3 more. He stood in the command center, buried deep beneath the surface of Luna, and watched as 40 years of secrecy came to life on the screens around him. The room was filled with officers and technicians, and the air smelled like recycled oxygen and cold coffee and fear. Every person in this room had known this day might come, and every single one of them had hoped it would not. Status report, Okafor said, and his voice was calm because panic was a luxury that admirals could not afford. Commander Sarah Lynn pulled up the main display, and the holographic map of the solar system filled the center of the room. But this was not the solar system. That the galaxy knew this was not the system of clumsy chemical rockets and primitive mining stations that humanity had shown to every alien visitor for the past 4 decades. This was the real one. All 16 hidden shipyards are active. Lynn said Europa Yard's report Full Combat Readiness Series facility is bringing the last of the Wolfpack corvettes online. Titan Station has begun deploying the autonomous mine networks into the outer system. HFY nodded and looked at the numbers, and the numbers were beautiful and terrible at the same time. 40 years ago, when humanity had made first contact with the Velani exploration vessel that stumbled into the solar system, the leaders of Earth had made a decision that would shape everything that followed. They looked at the galaxy and saw what it truly was. It was not a community of equals, it was a hierarchy built on power and fear. And the strong did whatever they wanted to the weak, and the weak smiled and said thank you. So humanity decided to appear weak. It was the greatest deception in the history of any species. Every alien delegation that visited Earth saw exactly what humanity wanted them to see. They saw clumsy ships with chemical rockets. They saw primitive kinetic weapons that seemed laughable compared to energy beams and plasma cannons. They saw a species that was struggling just to maintain a few small colonies and could barely keep its people fed. What they did not see was everything else. They did not see the rail guns. Humanity had never abandoned kinetic weapons because kinetic weapons were beautiful in their simplicity. A rail gun was nothing more than 2 magnetic rails and a projectile. But when you scaled that concept up and poured 4 decades of engineering into it, you got something that could launch a 10-kilogram tungsten slug at 1/10 the speed of light. That slug would hit with the force of a small nuclear weapon, and no energy shield in the galaxy was designed to stop it because no other species had ever bothered to make kinetic weapons that powerful. Why would they when they had plasma beams and graviton lances and all the other elegant weapons of civilized warfare? They did not see the drone fleets. This was humanity's true masterpiece. Every elder race crewed their warships with thousands of soldiers, because that was how war had been fought for 10,000 years. A Dralith dreadnought carried 12,000 crew members and was a floating city of warriors and technicians and officers. A human Wolfpack corvette carried no one at all. It was small and fast and armed with a rail gun and guided by a tactical artificial intelligence that could think faster than any living brain. It did not need food or water or sleep or courage. It did not mourn its fallen, and it did not hesitate, and it did not fear death because it was not alive. And humanity had built 47,000 of them. They did not see the armor. Human ships had no shields because shields were energy constructs designed to stop energy weapons, and energy weapons were all the galaxy used. But human ships were covered in layered nano-ablative plating that could absorb directed energy and convert it into usable power. The harder you shot at a human ship with a plasma beam, the faster it could move. The galaxy had been shooting at the wrong kind of target for 10,000 years and did not even know it. HFY walked through the command center and stopped at each station and spoke to each officer personally, because that was the kind of leader he was. He had grown up in Lagos and had joined the military at 18 and had risen through the ranks not because he was the smartest or the most aggressive, but because he understood something that most commanders did not. War was not about destroying the enemy. War was about making the enemy understand that fighting you would cost more than it was worth. He reached the communication station, where a young lieutenant was monitoring galactic transmissions. "Anything from the Council?" HFY asked. "The Kreth Dominion has announced a pacification fleet," the lieutenant said, and his voice was tight. 300 warships. They are heading for Kepler 442b. HFY closed his eyes for just a moment. Kepler 442b was a garden world and humanity's largest colony outside the solar system. 60 million people lived there and grew food in soil that was not Earth's soil, but had become home anyway. Families lived there, and children went to school there, and people fell in love and grew old there. And the Kreth were coming to take it, because they believed that humanity could not stop them. How long until they arrive? HFY asked. 14 days. HFY opened his eyes and turned to Commander Lin. Deploy the Kepler Defense Package full Wolfpack deployment. I want every autonomous corvette we have in that sector online and armed within 10 days. Lin hesitated for just a moment. Admiral, that is 47,000 units if we deploy them all, and something goes wrong, we have nothing left. I know, HFY said, deploy them all. Yes, sir. HFY walked to the main display and looked at the map of human space. It was small compared to the great empire's 200 systems, give or take, a tiny corner of a galaxy that contained billions of stars. But it was theirs. He thought about Elena Vargas standing alone in that chamber, while 12 species laughed at her, and he felt something hot and heavy in his chest that was not quite anger and not quite sorrow, but something older than both. He picked up the fleet-wide communication device and spoke to every ship and every station and every soldier in the United Earth Navy. This is Fleet Admiral HFY. The Kreth Dominion has dispatched a war fleet to attack our people at Kepler 442b. They believe we are weak, they believe we are primitive, they believe we will break. He paused, and the silence was absolute across 1,000 channels. 40 years ago we looked at the galaxy, and we saw that it respected only one thing: power, not kindness, not wisdom, not justice, power. We spent 40 years building that power in secret, because we hoped we would never need it. That hope is now gone. He took a breath. The Kreth are about to learn something that the galaxy has never understood about humanity. We do not fight because we enjoy it. We do not fight because we are good at it. We fight because someone looked at our families and our homes and our children and decided they could take them. And when that happens, we do not negotiate, and we do not retreat, and we do not stop. He set the device down and looked at the main display, where 47,000 tiny lights were beginning to move toward Kepler 442b like a swarm of fireflies heading into the dark. In 14 days, the Kreth pacification fleet would arrive at Kepler 442b, expecting to find a primitive colony defended by a handful of crude warships. They would find something else entirely. On the bridge of the Kreth flagship, Grand Admiral Velek Thros reviewed his battle plan and felt nothing but confidence. 300 warships, each one shielded and armed with plasma batteries that could melt through a kilometer of solid rock. The humans had maybe 50 ships in the sector if his intelligence was correct, and those ships were primitive things, barely worth the ammunition it would take to destroy them. This would be easy, this would be quick. The humans would surrender or die, and the Kreth would claim their world, and the galaxy would move on as it always did. Velek Thros had fought 17 campaigns in his career, and won all of them. He had never known defeat, and he could not imagine what it felt like. In 14 days he would learn. The Kreth pacification fleet dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Kepler 442 system, in perfect formation, 300 warships arranged in the traditional Kreth assault pattern, which was a layered sphere with the heaviest dreadnoughts at the center and lighter cruisers on the outer ring. It was a formation that had crushed 46 species over 8,000 years, and Grand Admiral Velek Thros saw no reason why the 47th would be any different. His censor officer was a young Kreth named Shal, who had excellent eyes and fast mandibles, and had never been wrong about a reading in her entire career. She was the first to see what was waiting for them. "Grand Admiral," she said, and her voice had a quality that Velek had never heard from her before, and it took him a moment to realize it was fear. "I am detecting contacts." "How many?" Velek asked, and he was already bored because he expected the answer to be 50 or maybe 100 if the humans had been busy. Shawl did not answer immediately. She ran the scan again and then a third time, and then she turned to look at him, and her compound eyes were wide. 47,216. The bridge went silent. Velik walked to the sensor display and looked at it himself, and the screen was so full of contacts that it had become a solid wall of red. There were so many signatures that the computer could not separate them in. To individual markers they filled every vector above and below, and to every side they were everywhere. "That is not possible," Velik said. "Grand Admiral," his communications officer called out, "we are receiving a transmission from the human forces." "Put it through." The voice that filled the bridge was calm and human and female, and it spoke in perfect Kreth. "Kreth Pacification Fleet, this is Captain Diana Torres of the United Earth Navy Kepler Defense Command. You have entered sovereign human space. You have 60 seconds to reverse course and retreat. If you do not, you will be destroyed. This is your only warning." Velik stared at the sensor display, and for the first time in 17 campaigns, he felt something cold settle into his chest, but he was Grand Admiral of the Kreth Dominion, and he had never retreated, and his entire species was watching, and so he made the decision that would haunt the galaxy. All ships advance standard assault formation, target the largest enemy contacts, and fire at will. The Kreth fleet surged forward, and 300 ships opened fire simultaneously. Plasma beams lit up the void in brilliant blue-white streams, and for a moment the space around Kepler 442b looked like a star was being born. The plasma hit the first wave of human corvettes and did absolutely nothing. The beams struck the nano-ablative armor and were absorbed, and the corvettes actually accelerated, because the armor was converting the incoming energy into thrust. The harder the Kreth shot, the faster the human ships moved. And then the human ships shot back. The first rail gun volley consisted of 6,000 tungsten slugs, each weighing 10 kilograms each, traveling at 30,000 kilometers per second. They crossed the distance between the two fleets in less than a heartbeat. Kreth shields were energy constructs designed to disperse directed energy beams. They were elegant and powerful, and had protected Kreth ships for millennia. They had absolutely no effect on a solid tungsten rod, moving at a fraction of the speed of light. The slugs went through the shields as if they did not exist. They went through the hull plating as if it were paper. They went through the internal structures and the crew compartments and the engine rooms, and out the other side. The first Kreth dreadnought did not explode. It simply came apart. A hole appeared in its center where nothing had been a moment before, and the structural integrity failed, and the ship broke into 3 pieces that tumbled away into the dark. 14 more dreadnoughts died in the same second. Velik watched his fleet begin to burn, and his mind could not process what he was seeing, because what he was seeing was impossible. The Kreth had been a military power for 8,000 years, and they had never lost a capital ship in combat, and now they were losing them faster than his tactical display could update. "Evasive maneuvers," he shouted. "All ships break formation and engage independently. Target the smaller vessels. Concentrate fire." But the human corvettes were not flying in formation. They were swarming. They moved like a living thing, a single organism made of 47,000 parts, and they flowed around the Kreth ships like water around stones. Each corvette was small and fast and nearly impossible to hit, and there were so many of them that the point defense systems could not track them all. The Kreth gunners would lock onto one corvette and destroy it, and 10 more would take its place. They would fire their plasma beams, and the beams would be absorbed, and the corvettes would come closer and closer until they were inside the shield perimeter. And then the rail guns would fire at point-blank range, and another Kreth ship would die. It took 11 minutes. In 11 minutes, the Kreth pacification fleet ceased to exist as a fighting force. 200, and 96 warships were destroyed, not damaged, not disabled, destroyed, torn apart by tungsten and physics, and the fury of a species that the galaxy had dismissed as bacteria. 4 ships survived because they were at the very edge of the formation, and their captains had the good sense to run the moment. The first dreadnought fell, they fled into faster-than-light travel and carried the news back to Kreth space. Grand Admiral Velik Thros was not among the survivors. His flagship was hit by 37 rail-gun slugs simultaneously, and there was not enough left of the ship to fill a cargo container. Human losses were 6,112 drone corvettes, 0 crewed vessels, 0 human casualties. Captain Diana Torres sat in her command frigate and watched the debris field spread across the void, and felt nothing like triumph. She felt tired and sad and old, because she understood what this meant. This was not the end of anything, this was the beginning. The news spread across the galaxy at the speed of light, and then faster because every species had their own communication networks, and the story was too enormous to contain. The Kreth had sent 300 warships to crush a human colony, and the humans had destroyed them all in 11 minutes. The galactic news networks played the sensor recordings on every channel and every station and every world, and the galaxy watched in silence as the mighty Kreth fleet was torn to pieces by ships that had no crews and weapons that were supposed to be primitive. On Ethira Prime, the Council convened an emergency session, and the chamber that had been full of laughter just months ago was now full of something else entirely. The Veleni ambassador demanded action, but could not say what kind. The smaller species huddled together and whispered. The Urani said nothing at all because the Urani were old enough to recognize what they were seeing. They were seeing the birth of a new power. And on the highest platform, Elder Speaker Rothan Vel of the Dralith hegemony watched the battle footage with eyes that had seen 1,000 years of warfare, and his ancient hands gripped the armrests of his chair so hard that his claws left marks in the metal. He was not laughing anymore. No one was laughing anymore. Elena Vargas returned to the council chamber 3 days after the battle. She did not petition. She did not request. She walked to the center of the floor and looked up at the 12 species that had mocked her, and she spoke clearly. 6 months ago, I stood here and asked for recognition. I asked for respect. I asked to be treated as equals, and you laughed. She paused, and the silence was complete. We will not ask again. Humanity does not seek war, but we will not tolerate aggression. Any fleet that enters human space with hostile intent will be met with the full force of our military capability. You have seen what that looks like. You have 11 minutes of footage that shows you exactly what that looks like. She turned and walked out, and this time every single delegate watched her go. In the private chambers of the Dralith Embassy, Supreme Commander Calith Sorvan reviewed the battle data for the 15th time. He was younger than Rothan Vel and stronger, and he had been bred for war since before he could walk. He had commanded more ships than any living Dralith, and he had never known fear. But his claws were trembling. The humans had not just won, they had won so completely and so quickly that it rewrote every military assumption the galaxy had held for 10,000 years, and Calith understood something that the politicians did not yet grasp. This could not stand if humanity was allowed to exist as a military power. The entire structure of galactic civilization would collapse. The Dralith sat at the top because they were the strongest, and if they were no longer the strongest, then everything fell apart. He opened a channel to every Dralith shipyard and every fleet command and every military installation across the hegemony. Summon every ship, he said, every last one. The galaxy held its breath. The Dralith did not make the same mistake as the Kreth. Supreme Commander Calith Sorvan spent 3 months preparing, and in those 3 months, he studied every second of the Battle of Kepler 442b, until he knew it better than the humans who had fought it. He identified the weaknesses that the Kreth had been too arrogant to see, and he built his strategy around them. The human drone corvettes were fast and deadly, but they had limited range and needed command frigates to coordinate them, destroy the command ships, and the swarm would lose its brain. The human rail guns were devastating, but they needed time to reload between volleys, create enough chaos, and close the distance fast enough, and you could get inside their effective range. The human armor absorbed energy weapons, but it could be overwhelmed by sustained, concentrated fire from multiple angles. Calith was not a fool. He was perhaps the finest military mind the Dralith had produced in 1,000 years, and he assembled the largest fleet the galaxy had seen since the Silence Wars. 22,000 warships. He also deployed gravity well generators, massive devices that created artificial distortions in space-time that prevented faster-than-light travel within their range. The humans would not be able to run, they would have to stand and fight, and Calith intended to make them fight on his terms. The war began on a Tuesday by Earth's calendar. The Dralith struck at 7 human systems simultaneously, and the first battles were not like Kepler 442b. At all, the Dralith had learned and adapted, and they came in fast and hard, and they targeted the command frigates first, and they brought enough ships to absorb the rail gun volleys and keep coming. The colony at Wolf 1061 fell in 2 days, not because the human defenses failed, but because Calith had sent 2,000 ships against a garrison of 3,000 corvettes, and the math simply did not work. The colonists were evacuated before the Dralith arrived, because Admiral Akafar had seen the attack coming, but the world itself was lost. Barnard's star was worse. The Dralith arrived with gravity well generators already active, and the human defense fleet could not retreat. They fought for 16 hours and destroyed 400 Dralith warships, but they were overwhelmed. The command frigate ISS Spartacus was destroyed, and its 300 crew members died, and without coordination the corvettes fought on independently, but they were less effective alone, and one by one they were hunted down. The galaxy watched, and the narrative began to shift. The Kreth defeat had made humanity seem invincible, but the Dralith were proving that they were not, and the elder races began to relax because the old order was reasserting itself. The strongest species was still the strongest, and the upstart humans were being put in their place. Admiral Akafar stood in the Luna Command Center and watched his people die on screens that showed nothing but numbers and symbols, but each number was a ship, and each ship had a crew or a tactical AI that had been built by human hands, and each loss was a piece of humanity torn away. "We cannot hold every system," Commander Lin said, and her voice was raw from days without sleep. "We are losing ground on every front." "I know," Akafar said. "The Dralith outnumber us 3-1 in every engagement. They have adapted to the Wolfpack tactics, and their gravity well generators are cutting off our retreat options. We need to change strategy." "I know," Akafar said again. He had always known this might happen. The Kepler victory had been possible because the Kreth were arrogant and unprepared, but the Dralith were neither. They were ancient and ruthless, and they learned from the mistakes of others, and they had enough ships to trade losses at a rate that would bleed humanity dry. But Akafar had not spent 40 years building only drones and rail guns. He had also spent 40 years studying the Dralith. He knew their history, he knew their politics, he knew that the Dralith hegemony was not a single unified empire, but a collection of conquered species held together by fear. He knew that the Dralith had slave races who built their ships and grew their food and maintained their stations, and those slave races hated their masters with a fury that burned in silence. And he knew where their shipyards were. "Initiate Operation Longbow," he said. Lin stared at him. "Admiral, that requires pulling 60% of our remaining forces from the border systems. If it fails, we lose everything. If we keep fighting the way we are fighting, we lose everything anyway. The Dralith can replace their ships. We cannot. We need to take away their ability to build more." Lin closed her eyes and then opened them and nodded. "Yes, sir." The plan was simple in concept and insane in execution. 100 command frigates and 15,000 corvettes would disengage from the border fighting and make a faster-than-light jump deep behind Dralith lines to the shipyard complex at Sorvan's Reach, the industrial heart of the hegemony, where 60% of all Dralith warships were built. It was a one-way trip. The gravity well generators that the Dralith had deployed along the border would prevent any retreat. Once the attack force revealed itself, they would either destroy the shipyards or they would die trying. Captain Marcus Oliveira commanded the strike force from the bridge of the ISS Thermopylae. He was 34 years old, and he had 2 daughters back on Earth, and he had written them each a letter that would be delivered if he did not come home. The strike force jumped, and for 3 days they traveled through the void in complete silence. No communications, no active sensors, nothing that might alert Dralith patrols to their presence. They moved like ghosts through the space between stars. On the 4th day, they arrived at Sorvan's Reach. The shipyard complex was enormous, a ring of orbital stations and construction platforms that circled a gas giant, each one capable of building a dreadnought in 6 months. There were defensive platforms and patrol fleets, and it was the most heavily guarded location in the hegemony. It was not guarded heavily enough. The Wolfpack corvettes hit the defense platforms first, 15,000 drones swarming in from every direction, and the Dralith defenders had prepared for a frontal assault, not an attack from behind their own lines. The defense platforms were designed to face outward toward potential enemies, not inward toward what should have been safe space. The battle lasted 4 hours, and it was brutal and ugly, and nothing like the clean 11-minute victory at Kepler. The Dralith fought hard, and they fought well, and they destroyed 3,000 corvettes and 8 command frigates. The ISS Thermopylae was hit by a concentrated barrage from 3 Dralith battlecruisers that coordinated their fire to overwhelm the ablative armor. Captain Oliveira ordered all hands to abandon ship, but the escape pods launched into a debris field, and only half of them survived. 4,000 crew members died, including Oliveira himself. But the shipyards burned. Every construction platform, every orbital station, every half-built dreadnought sitting in its cradle, all of it torn apart by rail gun fire, and left as a spreading field of wreckage, orbiting a gas giant that did not care. When the battle was over, the surviving human ships found themselves trapped behind enemy lines, with no way home, and Dralith reinforcements closing in from every direction. Commander Lynn, who had taken command after Oliveira's death, made a decision. She broadcast a signal on all frequencies. Attention, all Dralith slave species within range of this transmission. This is the United Earth Navy. We have destroyed the shipyards at Sorvan's Reach. The hegemony's ability to build new warships has been crippled. If you wish to fight for your freedom, we will give you weapons, we will give you ships, we will give you everything we have. The response was not immediate, but it came. First 1 ship, then 10, then 100 slave-crewed transport vessels and mining ships and cargo haulers that had been pressed into Dralith service broke away from their convoys and made for the human position. They came with nothing but their hatred for their masters and their desperate hope that this time things might be different. The war had changed. Back on Ethira Prime, the Council fractured the Veleni Concordat, declared neutrality, and withdrew their ambassadors from both sides. 3 smaller species began secretly funneling intelligence to humanity. The Kreth Dominion, still bleeding from their own humiliation, sued for a separate peace, and humanity accepted, because Akafor understood that every enemy removed from the board was a victory. Supreme Commander Calith Sorvan stood in his war room and watched the footage from Sorvan's Reach, and saw the burning remains of everything his species had built over centuries, and he felt something he had never felt before. It was not anger, and it was not fear. It was recognition. He was looking at an enemy that fought the way the Dralith had always claimed to fight, without mercy, without hesitation. And without any concern for the cost, the humans had sent their people on a mission that they knew was likely suicide, and those people had gone willingly, and they had died willingly, and they had accomplished their objective. Caliph whispered into the empty room, and his voice was the voice of someone watching the sun set on everything he had ever known. What have we awakened? The war ended not with a bang, but with a message. It came 6 months after the destruction of Sorvan's Reach, and by then the galaxy had changed in ways that no one could have predicted. The Draelith hegemony was still powerful, but it was wounded and bleeding, and for the first time in 9,000 years, it was losing territory not to humanity, but to its own slave species who had risen up across dozens of systems, inspired by the human broadcast from the burning shipyards. Supreme Commander Caliph Sorvan sat alone in his command chamber aboard the Draelith flagship Wrath of Ages and stared at the strategic display that showed him the truth that his propaganda networks refused to admit. The hegemony was crumbling not from the outside but from within. His shipyards were gone, his slave labor force was in open rebellion, his fleet had lost 4,000 warships and could not replace them. His allies on the council had abandoned him one by one like animals fleeing a forest fire. And the humans were still coming. Not in the overwhelming swarms of Kepler 442b, and not in the desperate strikes of Sorvan's Reach, but in something worse. They were coming in small groups, raiding supply lines and destroying communication relays, and appearing where they should not be and vanishing before the Draelith could respond. They fought like shadows, and every time Caliph committed forces to hunt them down, another rebellion would erupt behind him. He had 10,000 warships left, and it was not enough. It would never be enough, because he was not fighting a fleet, he was fighting an idea, and you could not kill an idea with plasma beams. The message arrived on a channel that should have been impossible to access, a private Draelith military frequency that was encrypted with codes that changed every hour. The fact that the humans could reach him here told Caliph everything he needed to know about how deeply they had penetrated his systems. The message was text only, and it said, "Commander Sorvan, this is Ambassador Elena Vargas of the United Earth Diplomatic Corps. You are losing this war, and you know it. Your shipyards are destroyed, your slave species are in revolt, and your allies have abandoned you. You can continue to fight, and your hegemony will collapse entirely, or you can talk to me. The choice is yours." Caliph read the message 7 times. He thought about his father, who had been Supreme Commander before him, and his grandfather. Before that, he thought about the 9,000 years of Draelith supremacy, and the billions of his people who depended on him, and the legacy that he had been born to protect. Then he thought about the humans who had sent their soldiers on a suicide mission to destroy his shipyards, and he thought about the slave species who were dying by the thousands for a chance at freedom, and he thought about what another year of war would cost. He typed his response with claws that no longer trembled, because he had moved past fear into something like acceptance. "I will talk." The negotiations took place on neutral ground aboard a Velani observation vessel in the empty space between star systems. Elena Vargas represented humanity, and Caliph Sorvan represented the hegemony, and they sat across from each other at a simple table with no guards and no weapons and no audience. Elena looked older than she had in the council chamber a year ago. There were lines around her eyes that had not been there before, and her hair had streaks of gray that were new. She had spent the last year carrying the weight of a war that had killed thousands of her people, and it showed. Caliph looked worse. His scales had lost their luster, and there was a wound on his left arm that had not healed properly, because Draelith medical facilities were overwhelmed with casualties. He was the most powerful military commander in the galaxy, and he looked like someone who had not eaten in days. "You know our terms," Elena said. "I know what I expect your terms to be," Caliph replied. "Reparations, territorial concessions, occupation, forces, disarmament. That is what the victor demands." "Those are not our terms." Caliph blinked, which was the Dralith expression of surprise. Then what are your terms? Alina placed a data tablet on the table and slid it across to him. Recognition of human sovereignty over a 200-system sphere around Sol, the same thing I asked for a year ago in the council chamber. Caliph stared at her. That is all. No, there is more. We want the council restructured. Every species gets a voice and a vote, not just the elder races, not just the powerful ones, everyone. We want the slave species emancipated, all of them, in every Dralith system. We want a mutual defense compact that protects every member species equally, so that no one ever has to stand alone in that chamber and be laughed at again. Caliph picked up the tablet and read through the full terms, and his confusion deepened with every line. There were no reparations. There was no demand for Dralith territory. There was no occupation, no punishment, no humiliation. I do not understand, he said, and for the first time since the war began, he sounded not like a commander, but like a person who was genuinely lost. When you could take everything, our worlds, our resources, our technology, you could break the hegemony into pieces and rule over us the way we ruled over others. Why are you not doing that? Alina was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke, her voice was not the voice of a diplomat. It was the voice of a woman who was very tired and very sad, and who had seen too many people die. Because we remember what it is like to be small. Caliph said nothing. Humanity spent 40 years pretending to be weak, because we were afraid of what the galaxy would do to us. If it knew the truth, we watched species get conquered and enslaved and erased. And we knew that could be us. We built our weapons in secret because we had no choice, but we never wanted to use them. She leaned forward and looked into his ancient red eyes. We did not fight this war to become you, commander. We fought so that no one would ever laugh at the small again. If we take your worlds and enslave your people, we become exactly what we were fighting against, and everything our people died for means nothing. The silence between them was heavy with the weight of everything that had happened, and everything that might happen next. Caliph set the tablet down and placed both his clawed hands flat on the table, and lowered his head, which was the Dralith gesture of deepest respect, a gesture that no supreme commander had ever made to another species in the entire history of the hegemony. I accept your terms, he said. The Treaty of Ethira was signed 14 days later in the same chamber, where Alina had been laughed at. The ceremony was broadcast across every world in every system, and billions of beings watched as the galaxy changed. The council was restructured exactly as humanity demanded. Every species received a vote and a voice. The Dralith slave species were emancipated and given seats of their own, and some of them wept openly because they had never been allowed to speak in that chamber before the Mutual Defense Compact was ratified by every member species, including the Dralith, who signed it with the understanding that they were no longer at the top of the hierarchy, because there was no longer a hierarchy. Elder Speaker Rothenvel, who had once compared humanity to bacteria, stood at his platform and watched it all happen, and said nothing at all. He was old enough to recognize when the world had changed beyond his ability to understand it, and wise enough to keep his mouth shut. Admiral Akafer attended the ceremony in his dress uniform, and stood in the back, and did not speak to anyone. He had won the war, but he had lost people and ships and pieces of himself that he would never get back, and he was not in the mood for celebration. He watched Alina sign the treaty, and he felt something like relief, but it was colored with grief for everyone who had not lived to see this day. Captain Oliveira and the 4,000 crew of the Thermopylae Commander Lin, who had led the survivors behind enemy lines for 3 months, the garrisons at Wolf 1061, and Barnard Star. Every drone corvette that had been destroyed was a machine, but every machine had been built by human hands, and every loss was felt. The story should have ended there with the signing and the ceremony and the new order, but it did not, because stories about change never really end. They just reach a moment where something shifts and the world is different from what it was before. That moment came 3 years later. Elena Vargas was still the human ambassador to the council, because no one else wanted the job, and because she was good at it. She had aged visibly in those 3 years, and her hair was more gray than black now, and she walked with a slight limp from an injury sustained during the war, but her eyes were still sharp, and her voice still carried. She was sitting in the council chamber during a routine session when the doors opened, and a delegation walked in that no one had seen before. They were small creatures barely a meter tall with soft fur and wide dark eyes, and they moved in a tight group, as if they were afraid that the chamber itself might swallow them. Their leader walked at the front and clutched a data tablet to their chest, and their hands were shaking so badly T. Had the tablet rattled. A new species recently contacted by a Velani survey ship and brought to the council to make their petition. The small alien walked to the center of the chamber and looked up at the platforms that rose above them on every side, and the fear on their face was visible to everyone. They opened their mouth to speak, and nothing came out, and they tried again, and still nothing came out, and the data tablet nearly fell from their trembling hands. Elena watched from the human platform, and she saw herself standing in that same spot 3 years ago alone, and afraid and surrounded by laughter. She saw every species that had ever stood there and been told they were not enough. She stood up from her seat, and every eye in the chamber turned to her. She walked down from the human platform and crossed the chamber floor, and her boots made the same sharp sounds they had made years ago. But this time, every delegate watched, because when the human ambassador moved, the galaxy paid attention. She stopped in front of the small, trembling alien, and she knelt down so that she was at their eye level, and she smiled. And it was not the cold smile she had given Marcus Chen. When she activated Prometheus, it was warm and real. And it was the smile of someone who understood exactly what it felt like to be small and scared and alone in a room full of giants. She extended her hand. "Welcome," she said. "You will find you have friends here." The small alien looked at her hand, and then at her face, and then slowly, carefully reached out and took it and held on tight. Above them, the council was silent. No one laughed. No one would ever laugh again.